All right, so if we take a look at a page that has the DS namespace loaded on it, what we'll see here in the console is a whole bunch of information getting dumped out here as the DS namespace loads and does its initial functionality. So let's take a look at that in detail here. So here at the end of the namespace, you'll see an onLoad entry, and that is linked to a set timeout, which means that this code inside of this function here will run after 100 milliseconds have passed. So just after the DS namespace is loaded, this code will execute 100 milliseconds later. So what we see here is a quick little note out to the console to let us know that the namespace was loaded. And we see some code here that expands jQuery's functionality. So we add support for cross-origin requests. We add a function here to get a script file and ensure that that file is cached so that that page loading could be faster next time. We add another function here to get a page's content, including any script content that it may contain. Then we set up the default options for any AJAX calls that are made as part of the DS namespace, and we specifically configure it here to return our data as JSON data. And we have another message out to the console here to let us know that the DS namespace was able to extend jQuery with some additional functions. Then we set up an event here to wait for the document to report as ready, and when it has, we attempt to retrieve the current SharePoint user interface version, the current page type that the user is viewing, and then we check if the page is in edit mode, and if it's not, we kick off a big block of code here called wait for idle to load resources. Wait for idle to load resources is an interval object that runs a block of code repeatedly every X number of milliseconds until a condition returns as true. In this case, what we're doing is we're waiting for the sp.js script file to be loaded. Then we're waiting for the window document object to have a ready state of complete. And we're waiting for the DS store session idle time variable value to be greater than or equal to half the timeout time for this interval. When all of that is true, then bSuccess here is set to true. And in that case, when we get here, it's going to run the onSuccess function. If we never get bSuccess to equal true, and this code continues to loop until the timeout milliseconds has been reached, then the timeout function or onTimeoutFX will be run. When that happens, all that happens is we see a message out to the console informing us that we never got the success condition for wait for idle to load resources. However, if we did get a successful detection, then it's going to go ahead and dump a message out to the console to that effect, and then it's going to run the afterFX function here that's included in the object. And that afterFX function is what's responsible for loading the additional portions of the DS namespace. So this includes several collections of constants, enumerations, and also some supplementary files to add the widgets and controls to the namespace. Once those script files have been loaded via calls of the getCached function that we talked about earlier, the function is going to see if it was set to get all the list and fields, and if so, kick off the wait for all list and fields interval object. Otherwise, it's just going to try and see if it can get the settings for the current page from the DS form settings list. And then finally, it's going to kick off the DS pages all function. The wait for all lists and fields interval object simply calls a function here in the utility portion of the namespace to see if all list definitions have been retrieved, and if so, it goes ahead and tries to get the settings for the current page from the DS form settings list. We also see here that it will wait a few moments and then check to see if it can show the dsMagic configuration button in the lower right-hand corner of the browser, and that is this button right here. The DS pages all function simply monitors for some user activities such as mouse movements, key presses, and mouse clicks, or windows being focused or minimized to detect user activity. And when that user activity is detected, it will reset the idle time under ds.store.session.idle_time to be 0. So this is how we wait for user idle before we load any additional resources for the DS namespace.